Hi friends, welcome to this video. Today I want to talk to those of you who are preparing for ProPrac exams, practice management, project management, and construction and evaluation. More specifically, I want to talk about B101. I intend this video to be somewhat of a commentary video as I'm reading these articles, and I printed out the copy of the contract um, so that I mimic the same experience that you are going through. So as you're watching this video, I would certainly recommend that you have this printed copy in front of you, or if you have it on your handheld device, so that you can follow along what I'm reading and comments that I'm making on it. Um, I think when it comes to studying these contracts, you will get the most if you try to envision situations that would in a way make that sentence appear in the contract. So everything that you read is there for a reason, is because something has happened and then AIA decided to add something in the contract that will address that situation. Um, it's pretty important, and I'm here to help. But before I dive into this, I want to just emphasize how reading these contracts is going to help you develop a skill that is going to be very, very important as you're taking these AREs, because when you are reading these contracts, you really, really have to put your attorney hat on and think what each of these words mean and why are they there, and not another word is there. So if that makes sense right now. If it doesn't, don't worry, you'll get it as we dive into this. And just kind of being able to look for those keywords and have them trigger other concepts in your head is going to be extremely, extremely valuable on the exam. So I know this all may sound abstract to you right now, but it's easy and you'll immediately get it once we dive into this. And also, I guess before I start reading, um, feel free to speed up this video so that you're kind of like not wasting time, I guess, because time is important. Okay, so I guess before we really dive in, I think it's important to kind of understand the, let's call it, anatomy of this contract. So, I mean, as you can see, it has, and I printed it like both sides, it has quite a few pages, 23 pages. It has how many articles? 13 articles. Absolutely, there's no reason for you to be remembering that like Article 8 is claims and disputes. No, you're not going to be tested on that. But just kind of like knowing like what the first page looks like, and then we start looking at it and you see, okay, this is agreement made as of this day, month, year, okay, between the architect's client identified as the owner, name, legal status, address, and other information. So this is where you identify who is paying you, and then the architect, name, legal status, address, and other information. And then we have for the following project, name, location, and detailed description. So ideally you want to see here name, location, and detailed description. But the thing is, on the following page, you are going to have some questions that are sort of going to address this detailed description part. So most of the time, what you will see here is just going to say, oh, it's a new residence hall for university, blah, blah, blah. It's the street, blah, 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 state, blah, 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 zip code, and all that stuff. It's pretty straightforward, right? And then here at the bottom, it says, the owner and architect agree as follows. So I guess something that I should also mention before we dive into the rest of this is that contracts are, like, the thing is, when you sign a contract, that means that there is going to be obviously a transaction of service or money, or goods. Something is going to change, like switch owners, right? So only if you have a contract, this process of um, changing services and money can be monitored. So if you don't have a contract, that means you can't really sue that person. That means that person doesn't need to pay you because you don't have anything written down. So the purpose of these contracts, obviously, is that you can monitor this transaction of money versus service in this case. So, okay, we have table of articles. We're gonna go through those as we go. So Article 1, Initial Information, 1.1. This agreement is based on the initial information set forth in this section 1.1. Usually when you see these capitalized words, that means that they are defined somewhere, and you should really know what this means. Just because sometimes, like, project will be capitalized, and you need to understand how, like, what that word means in the context of the contract. But don't worry, we'll get there. So for each item in this section, insert the information or a statement such as not applicable or unknown at time of execution. There isn't really much to say there. So then it goes further. 1.1.1, the owner's program for the project. Insert the owner's program, identify documentation that establishes the owner's program, or state the manner in which the program will be developed. So pretty straightforward. You have to say, yeah, we're building a residence hall that is going to have a dining facility and 3 faculty apartments and 500 beds. List your program. Now, in this case, as default, agreement assumes that the owner will come to the architect with the program. Now, if that happens, architect doesn't really care who made the program or where program is coming from. However, owner can hire the same architect to provide program as part of architect's deliverables, like as part of their service. But later on, we will see that programming is not a basic service. It is part of what is called supplemental services, which are, kind of the name explains it. It is something that comes on top of the basic scope. So yeah, and then in this 1.1.1, you just need to, the owner needs to provide this whole documentation on like what the program is. 1.1.2, the project's physical characteristics. Identify or describe pertinent information about the project's physical characteristics, such as size, location, dimensions, geotechnical reports, site boundaries, topographic surveys, traffic and utility studies, availability of public and private utilities and services, legal description of the site, etc. So this means, this requires the owner to do a bunch of homework before they sign this contract. So, I mean, this is really important to pay attention to this list of things that the owner is in charge of. And if I were you, I would just kind of make a list rather than like a line, because if you don't know by now, I'm sort of obsessed with lists. So because that sort of helps me grasp the entirety of what needs to happen in this case. Then 1.1.3, the owner's budget for the cost of the work as defined in section 6.1. Provide total and, if known, a line item breakdown. So the owner needs to say the owner just needs to say their budget for the project. Obviously, that number can have many breakdowns, and in some cases, as you will see in A201, the contractor can actually require the owner to provide evidence that they are able to cover this cost. But that's not really the case here. At the point of signing the contract with the architect, the owner does not need to show that they are able to finance the project. Then 1.1.4, the owner's anticipated design and construction milestone dates. Point 1, design phase milestone dates, if any. So architect and the owner would fill this in and agree. Point 2, construction commencement date. Point 3, substantial completion date or dates. Point 4, other milestone dates. And as you can see, we have here substantial completion capitalized, which means you need to be familiar with what that means, but we'll get there. Legally, I mean, in the context of the contract. 1.1.5, the owner intends the following procurement and delivery method for the project. Identify methods such as competitive bid or negotiated contract, as well as any requirements for accelerated or fast-track design and construction, multiple bid packages, or phase construction. So pretty much self-explanatory, but it is important to remember how much detail goes into these contracts. So in this agreement, like, the owner needs to say what delivery method is going to happen for this project. And as you would assume, if you're studying for these exams, you really need to be very familiar with what these terms mean: competitive bid, negotiated contract, fast track design, multiple bid packages, and phase construction. So make sure you cover that. 1.1.6, the owner's anticipated sustainable objective for the project. Identify and describe the owner's sustainable objective for the project, if any. Now, if you look at the very, very bottom of the page, you will see that this agreement B101 was updated the last time in 2017. And the time before that, it was 10 years earlier. And one thing that is different between those two is that it seems like AIA is getting increasingly concerned about sustainability, and they want to acknowledge that sustainability is playing a big part, increasingly big part, in projects. So they want to be more aware of that and honor that. So in this article, you would say, owner wants to pursue LEED Platinum or whatever, whatever is related to sustainability. 1.1.6.1, if the owner identifies a sustainable objective, the owner and architect shall complete and incorporate AIA document E204 sustainable project exhibit into this agreement to define the terms, conditions, and services related to the owner's sustainable objective. If E204 is incorporated into this agreement, the owner and architect shall incorporate the completed E204 into the agreements with the consultants and contractors performing services or work in any way associated with the sustainable objective. So as you can see, the sustainable objective is like an add-on, and if you are pursuing LEED Platinum in this exhibit E204, which by the way would be probably a good idea to look into. It's not very long, only a few pages. But if you are pursuing a sustainable objective, you need to list what it is, how you're going to do it, and who's going to be working on it. And that's pretty much it, right? Then 1.1.7, the owner identifies the following representative in accordance with section 5.3, list name, address, and other contact information. So sometimes your owner is not going to be a private person. You're going to have, I don't know, like a big LLC or something. And if you have an LLC, they still have to identify like the main person who's going to be the representative of them. 1.1.8, the persons or entities, in addition to the owner's representative, who are required to review the architect's submittals to the owner are as follows. So I personally work in a company that deals with schools a lot, and schools, universities, they a lot of times have multiple people that come to these meetings, and sometimes they are from the housing part, sometimes they're from facilities, sometimes you have vice president of student life, res life, all that kind of stuff, and you want to list those people here. 1.1.9, the owner shall retain the following consultants and contractors: list name, legal status, address, and other contact information. And then 0.1, geotechnical engineer. So this article is pretty important because it tells you, in addition to that list that we saw in 1.1.2, what the owner needs to provide to the architect before commencing any design work. Now, geotechnical engineer is somebody who is going to evaluate a lot of these things that are mentioned in 1.1.2, and that's definitely the owner's job. Now, I'm pretty sure that you will see practice questions that are essentially going to be asking who's in charge of paying geotechnical engineer, and it's always owner. So remember that. And then we have 0.2, civil engineer. Now, this one is interesting because, as you recall from that 1.1.2, civil engineer would be a person who could help the owner gather some of those site information like utilities and stuff like that. However, the owner may decide not to use a civil engineer. And if that happens, and then if the owner says, no, I don't want to hire a civil engineer, that does not mean that the owner doesn't care about getting those services. It's just that the owner doesn't want to deal with that. And if that is the case, then architect needs to deal with that. And then the architect will sign a contract with the civil engineer, and then civil engineer will act as a consultant to the architect. And if that's the case, that will fall under supplemental services. So if you go to page 11 of this agreement, you will see 4.1.1.8 civil engineering may be architect's responsibility. So, but if it's not, if the owner takes that responsibility, then this would be the place where they put, oh, it's civil engineer called, I don't know, whatever, and this is where they live, blah, blah, blah. No, not where they live, where their company is. Sorry. Other, if any, list any other consultants and contractors retained by the owner. This could be a programmer or could be anyone else who owner has their own separate contract with. 1.1.10, the architect identifies the following representative in accordance with section 2.3. So you can see that architect is capitalized, and usually this means that you have a principal who takes this legal responsibility to sign this contract, and usually that principal is the person whose information kind of goes into this article. 1.1.11, the architect shall retain the consultants identified in sections 1.1.11.1 and 1.1.11.2. List name, legal status, address, and other contact information. Consultants retained on their basic services. Point 1, structural engineer. Point 2, mechanical engineer. Point 3, electrical engineer. So this is essentially a list of your consultants. And this here is telling you that these people will have contractual relationships with you as an architect. So when they get paid, they won't get paid from the owner. You will be paying them as an architect. And then also, if something goes wrong, owner will not take any legal actions against them. The owner will take legal actions against you, and then you will take legal actions against your consultants. So does that make sense? It's pretty easy. 1.1.11.2, consultants retained under supplemental services. So again, we can go back to page 11, where we have listed all those supplemental services, and then if the owner didn't hire the civil engineer, that's the place where you put the civil engineer's information. And then like any of these, if they require a special person that you need to hire to help you do that, to help you deliver that service, you list them under this 1.1.11.2. And then 1.1.12, other initial information on which the agreement is based. So anything extra that wasn't talked about before. But usually, as you can see, AIA does a pretty good job hitting all these important pieces of information and addressing all the players on the project in this Article 1. 1.2, the owner and architect may rely on the initial information. Both parties, however, recognize that the initial information may materially change, and in that event, the owner and the architect shall appropriately adjust the architect's services, schedule for the architect's services, and the architect's compensation. The owner shall adjust the owner's budget for the cost of the work and the owner's anticipated design and construction milestones as necessary to accommodate material changes in the initial information. So for the initial information, you will go to these articles that we had previously seen. And as you saw, initial information talks about a lot of things. It also talks about dates, budget, who are the players. So this article here acknowledges that not always will you be able to deliver the project entirely as you intended it to be at the time when the agreement was signed. So this article here is to tell you that the initial information can still change, but that doesn't mean that anything else is going to be, in a sense, rendered invalid. 1.3, the parties shall agree upon protocols governing the transmission and use of instruments of service or any other information or documentation in digital form. The parties will use AIA document E203, Building Information Modeling and Digital Data Exhibit, to establish the protocols for the development, use, transmission, and exchange of digital data. I think it's a good idea to look into this E203 again. It's one of those 1 or 2 pagers that are pretty quick to go through. I think one important piece of information that occurs here for the first time, I believe, is this instruments of service. Later on, I think this agreement defines what this instruments of service is, but essentially it is everything that the architect does to deliver a project. So instruments of service is going to be drawings, it's going to be sketches, it's going to be renderings, all that, all the work that the architect outputs to deliver the project. And then considering like BIM modeling, some owners will say, well, I need a model, I want a model. And then some owners won't care because they just want the drawings or whatever you agree with them. But this E203 sort of regulates how that is kind of like monitored and how the owner can get the information that they need. Then 1.3.1, any use or reliance on all or a portion of a building information model without agreement to protocols governing the use of and reliance on the information contained in the model and without having those protocols set forth in the AIA document E203, Building Information Modeling and Digital Data Exhibit, and the requisite AIA document G202, Project Building Information Modeling Protocol form, shall be at the using or relying party's sole risk and without liability to the other party and its contractors or consultants, the authors of or contributors to the building information model, and each of their agents and employees. So what this means is that you have these 2 documents that you sign, and essentially if you give your model to the owner or to one of their hired contractors, and then they do something with it and things turn bad and something fails miserably or they hire another architect, this article will sort of get you out of like off the hook, because it is not, because the key part here is shall be at the using or relying party's sole risk and without liability to the other party and its contractors or consultants, the authors of or contributors to the building information model. So this means that you and your consultants who worked on the same model are not really responsible if something goes wrong later. So that concludes Article 1. I'm going to hit pause for now and continue a little later. Okay. Okay, so we're back and we have Article 2, Architect's Responsibilities. So if you look to the bottom of this page and if you flip it, it may seem like it's not a lot, but this Article 2 defines some pretty important concepts that are defining things that architect needs to do prior to signing this agreement, essentially. And you can see that, I guess before we dive into that, Article 2, we can sort of kind of reflect a little bit on what is in Article 1, Initial Information, which is like a lot of definitions, essentially, a lot of um, um, bringing what the project is about, the sustainability objective. It defines dates, it defines budget, and it also defines all the players that are going to be in some kind of contractual relationships with each other. Now, you may have noticed that this particular agreement does not identify the contractor, which sort of makes sense, but it also tells you that the AIA, B101, and NCARB sort of assume that majority of the cases that that we have are doing design bid build. So it is safe to assume that if you don't see it defined on your exam, it is safe to assume that it is design bid build, because naturally you get the contractor much later in the game. But also this Article 1 defined the delivery method, and that is also very important to remember and to understand those different delivery methods. And AHPP is a great resource for that. Okay, so we can come back to Article 2, Architect's Responsibilities. 2.1, the architect shall provide professional services as set forth in this agreement. The architect represents that it is properly licensed in the jurisdiction where the project is located to provide the services required by this agreement, or shall cause such services to be performed by appropriately licensed design professionals. So what this means is that your company can be based in Hawaii, let's say, but your project is in California. That means that your architect, probably the principal who is actually signing this contract, needs to be licensed in that state. So it doesn't matter that you have a license from Florida. You can't really be liable if the project is in Georgia or something. Nor you should be hired then, because it's illegal and unethical. 2.2, the architect shall perform in services consistent with the professional skill and care ordinarily provided by architects practicing in the same or similar locality under the same or similar circumstances. Well, actually, you know what? I just realized that I forgot to mention something on the previous article, which is if your company is based in Florida and you are licensed in Florida and your project is in Georgia and you don't have anyone on your team who is licensed in Georgia, you will then partner with a company in Georgia who has a licensed architect in Georgia, and then the whole thing can actually be legally okay. And this is what they mean by appropriately licensed design professionals. Okay, now coming back to 2.2. The architect shall perform its services consistent with the professional skill and care ordinarily provided by architects practicing in the same or similar locality under the same or similar circumstances. The architect shall perform its services as expeditiously as it is consistent with such professional skill and care and the orderly progress of the project. This is essentially a standard of care. So if you are preparing for these exams, you should be really, really familiar with what standard of care means. And this article 2.2 defines that. So, I mean, these things can still kind of feel a little fluffy because the thing is, if you are an architect in New York, let's say, and New York has its own regulations and has a bunch of things that somebody who is licensed in North Carolina, as hopefully I will be, may not be super familiar with. So if I get a project in New York and I'm licensed in New York and I get to work on a project there, and I make a mistake that is just like super, super serious mistake, and I get sued, and the owner tries to say that the standard of care that I'm supposed to stick to, I didn't do it. And what's going to happen is that the owner is going to bring an architect from New York, and the architect from New York is going to say, well, I think that's a really big mistake. I wouldn't have done it. And that is kind of going to work against me because it shows that the architect in that specific locality would not make a mistake that I made, which is really bad. So don't do that. Do your homework. 2.3, the architect shall identify a representative authorized to act on behalf of the architect with respect to the project. This was already mentioned, I think, in the initial information, but I guess just the fact that it repeats tells you how important that is. 2.4, except with the owner's knowledge and consent, the architect shall not engage in any activity or accept any employment, interest, or contribution that would reasonably appear to compromise the architect's professional judgment with respect to this project. So this means if you are working for a hotel developer, that hotel developer may, I mean, imagine if you are this hotel developer and you hired an architect, and that same architect goes to work for another hotel developer who's building a hotel 2 blocks down the street, you're not really going to be happy with that, right? This is a pretty simplified case, but you can have some serious conflicts of interest that can happen. And if you want to learn more about that, I think there are those rules of ethics and conduct that you should be pretty familiar with. And I think they go on to explain those cases. 2.5, the architect shall maintain the following insurance until termination of this agreement. If any of the requirements set forth below are in addition to the types and limits the architect normally maintains, the owner shall pay the architect as set forth in section 11.9. I guess we can just move forward because I guess, sorry. So you cannot really go out and practice uninsured. And this here is just to teach us weaklings and younglings what insurances you need to be paying attention to. Because if you make a mistake, like we saw it could happen, if you breach the standard of care, you can be liable. And then the question becomes, well, how do I pay them? How do I fix this mistake? And the mistakes can be pretty bad. If you go on YouTube, and you will find like many cases where either architects screwed up or architects consultants screwed up, and then somebody needs to pay the owner the damages. And in order for your business to not go belly up, you need insurance. And insurance is essentially you pay it, and then you pay your premium, and then if you make a mistake or something, they pay a certain amount of damages. So for instance, and I think we're going to be talking about this further down, but let's say you pay your premiums every year or every month, whichever way you agree with your insurance company. And then in your policy, you say that the insurance company will cover expenses up to $1 million, let's say. But then your mistake is so bad, it's like $5 million that you owe to the owner. But then guess what's going to happen? Like, your insurance will only cover this 1 million, so you will still have 4 millions to cover. So it can be pretty bad. But on the other hand, like if you make a mistake that is $500,000 worth, your insurance will pay $500,000. You won't pay anything. You will still have $500,000 left, but your premium is probably going to go up. It's the same as like for your car or health insurance. Okay, where were we? Okay, 2.5.1. Commercial general liability with policy limits of not less than blood dollars for each occurrence and blood dollars in the aggregate for bodily injury and property damage. Now, hopefully by now, you know what commercial general liability means. As you can see, it is capitalized here. So you should know it. In case you don't know, this this insurance will cover anything that sort of happens at your premises of where the work is happening. So if you, let's say, have an office that's on the 3rd floor and there are only stairs to your office, there's no elevator, and then your owner comes to visit and the owner falls down the stairs and or trips or something happens, and then the owner will sue you, and then your commercial general liability insurance will cover that. Now, if you kind of put architect on one side and contractor on the other side, like who do you think is going to be paying higher premiums for commercial general liability? Of course, it's going to be the contractor, because the whole building construction site can almost be a trap for somebody who doesn't know how to behave on a construction site, because the contractor's insurance is going to be responsible if you as an architect come to the construction site and you fall into a hole or something like that, and you will sue the you will sue, I guess, the owner, and then the owner will sue the contractor, and essentially the contractor's contractor's commercial general liability insurance will cover your expenses. So I think there are a few, as you will see, there's a few types of these insurances, and it is always a good idea to kind of put architect on one side and contractor on the other side and see who, like how their premiums compare. And as you would assume, architect's premium for commercial general liability is pretty small. Then 2.5.2, automobile liability, covering vehicles owned and non-owned vehicles used by the architect with policy limits of not less than blah dollars per accident for bodily injury, death of any person, and property damage arising out of the ownership, maintenance, and use of those motor vehicles, along with any other statutorily required automobile coverage. So this means that you should have an insurance that is going to cover you in case of a major damage that is caused by a car, essentially. So if you are, let's say, traveling to a construction site in your company's car, um, this insurance will cover you. But also, it's not uncommon that the owner will ask the architect to be to co-sign that policy because the owner wants to protect themselves from being sued by a third party. So, for instance, the owner can say, well, if you're traveling to my construction site in your car, and let's say contractor is with you in the car, I don't want to be on the hook, because if the owner does not co-sign that policy with you, the contractor can say, well, we were traveling to the owner's construction site and hence we should sue the owner, and kind of have the owner pay for those expenses. But if the owner co-signs your automobile insurance, then the same company will kind of pay expenses that would be incurred either by you or the owner. Then 2.5.3, the architect may achieve the required limits and coverage for commercial general liability and automobile liability through a combination of primary and excess or umbrella liability insurance, provided such primary and excess or umbrella liability insurance policies result in the same or greater coverage as the coverages required under sections 2.5.1 and 2.5.2, and in no event shall any excess or umbrella liability insurance provide narrower coverage than the primary policy. The excess policy shall not require the exhaustion of the underlying limits only through the actual payment by the underlying insurers. So it's a long way of saying, essentially, if you bundle your insurances, you still have to make sure that this bundle does not provide smaller coverage than the individual insurances. And one thing that I should have mentioned in the previous article, in the previous paragraph, is that if the owner is asking anything extra from you, including co-signing this automobile policy, you need to be paid for that, reimbursed for that. 2.5.5, employer's liability with policy limits not less than $dollars each accident, $dollars each employee, and $dollars policy limit. Employer's liability is essentially protecting the employer, like company owner, from being sued by an employee. And I mean, I guess both architects and contractors would be having their own employer's liabilities. 2.5.6, professional liability, covering negligent acts, errors, and omissions in the performance of professional services, with policy limits of not less than $dollars per claim and $dollars in the aggregate. Now, This professional liability is probably the most important insurance for an architect. And as you can see, it covers negligent acts, errors, and omissions in the performance of professional services. So if you don't stick to the standard of care, if you breach that, your professional liability is going to step in. So earlier when I was talking about insurance, I meant professional liability insurance. And if you compare professional liability insurance for an architect versus a contractor, this time is the other way around from the commercial general liability. So now architect pays high premiums for professional liability, and contractor doesn't really. But essentially, this is the insurance that will be helping you get out of the financial trouble. But again, as I explained earlier, if they pay something for you, naturally that is going to impact your premium. Then 2.5.7, additional insured obligations. To the fullest extent permitted by law, the architect shall cause the primary and excess or umbrella policies for commercial general liability and automobile liability to include the owner as an additional insured for claims caused in whole or in part by the architect's negligent acts of omission or omissions. The additional insured coverage shall be primary and not contributory to any of the owner's insurance policies and shall apply to both ongoing and completed operations. So we kind of covered this earlier. Another thing that I can mention is that it is not a bad idea to be, sorry, let me go back. Let me backtrack. As you can see, there is quite a few policies that are a good idea to have, and you should really be familiar with what each of them addresses. So as you can see, this article lists a bunch of these insurance policies that are good to have. It is a good idea to kind of have the same insurance company do all your policies, because if you have different insurance companies, it can sort of create delays while they're all kind of talking to each other. So it is a good idea to kind of have them all, even though not all of them may be kind of under this umbrella insurance, but if you have the same company, that will kind of help you expedite the process. Then to conclude this Article 2, we have 2.5.8, the architect shall provide certificates of insurance to the owner that evidence compliance with the requirements in the section 2.5. So this Article 2 is, as we saw, is sort of short, but is important because it lists the homework that the architect needs to do prior to signing this agreement. So as this last paragraph stated, you as an architect need to show to the owner that you indeed have these insurances for the project. So yeah, that's pretty much it about Article 2. Next up is going to be Article 3, Scope of Architect's Basic Services.